From New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 963. There's nothing fair about the FAIR Act. The bill will undermine Americans' freedom to contract, will burden the judicial system, both federal and all states in the country, and restrict access to justice. This bill will ban arbitration agreements across nearly all contracts. It outlaws arbitration agreements in employment disputes, consumer disputes, antitrust disputes, and civil rights disputes. It outlaws arbitration agreements with respect to not only big, huge corporations, but the most humble businesses and parties in the country, those that I served in my law practice. Democrats propose that arbitration is bad for Americans, but it has been a fixture of our legal landscape for almost 100 years. They claim that arbitration is forced. Both of their claims are wrong. Arbitration has many benefits. It is more efficient and faster than going to court. The rules are not nearly as arcane. Injured parties get their relief sooner and they spend less money along the way. Plaintiffs in employment and consumer disputes, according to studies, actually win more in arbitration than they do in court. They get more money in arbitration. They win more often in arbitration. Democrats know that arbitration has plenty of benefits. How do you know this? Because in this very bill, Democrats have carved out their union friends from the mandates of this bill. In other words, if the bill becomes law, powerful unions and no one else can still use these valuable agreements vis-a-vis individuals. This carve-out also tells us that Democrats know there is no such thing as forced arbitration. Agreements that are truly forced are already illegal under existing law in every state in the country. People are no more forced to agree to an arbitration provision than they are to agree to any other provision of a contract. The bill instead bans private parties from knowingly and willingly agreeing on a process to resolve future disputes. It tells Americans, no matter how informed or sophisticated they may be, that they can't be trusted to manage their own relationships by agreeing in advance to the means of resolution to be used in the event of a dispute. Our Democrat colleagues seem to believe that Americans can't be trusted to think for themselves. Big government needs to tell them what to do. Their freedom to contract should be restricted by the wisdom from Washington. Democrats argue that this bill is no big deal because parties can still decide to use arbitration after a dispute arises. But that never happens in practice for much the same reason that many disputes go to court and are resolved outside of a jury. About 1% to 2% actually go all the way. The decision to get into a lawsuit is not always purely rational, taken from all points of view, often affected by tempers that are different once the dispute has arisen than when the parties are considering it the position of cool judgment in advance. Their incentives change after a dispute has arisen. And people will pick a strategy to resolve that dispute at that time. They won't necessarily be looking for a process then that's good for both parties, for many reasons. When you're immersed in a dispute, there's also a greater chance that a lawyer that you may have retained would have an incentive to direct you in the direction of litigation rather than arbitration. And those incentives certainly won't necessarily be consistent with a faster and cheaper alternative. Rather than helping the little guy stand up to big companies, this bill will take the option to arbitrate off the table for everybody and put more money in the pockets of trial lawyers, most especially plaintiffs' class action trial lawyers. The bill will force more people into court. They'll pay more and possibly recover less. But it will also force some people out of the justice system altogether. Some people will be unable to pay for an expensive lawsuit, or they may have a claim so small that it is only practicable for them to bring it themselves, which arbitration facilitates. And let's be clear, too. The surge in new lawsuits hurts employment. It hurts businesses, keeps them from being able to afford to hire more people. It will raise their costs at the worst possible time, when they're already dealing with supply chain problems and record inflation caused by failed Democrat policies. And not only by prohibiting the use of arbitration going forward, but by retroactively eliminating it, rendering it null and void in millions of contracts already outstanding right now, at this point in our life of our nation, when we have 8% inflation. Another constraint on the supply chain imposed by Democrat policy. Everyone should be sounding the alarm on this blatant overreach. At the end of the day, this bill curries favor with the plaintiffs' bar and union bosses, and it does so at the expense of hardworking Americans and small businesses especially. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 963, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman